All right, guys, we're gonna get going here. So excited to have you guys be here with me in person. I was just this morning thinking like, I am so zoomed out, but so thank you for being here in person. And no offense to you guys on Zoom, but before we get started though, we've got Crystal from North Star that's gonna share some stuff with you, and then we'll get going.
Sweet. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
So I have 2 tips today. So one is not on the handout, but this is about sellers. As soon as you have a listing, open it with title. So we can start working on your PR, start getting over the CC&Rs, all of that stuff. So that way you can accommodate short closings if it's a cash or a short buyer closing. Another thing that a lot of people don't know is that now, because of COVID, thank you, COVID, sellers can completely sign electronically. So we have that service at North Star. A lot of other title companies do as well. So on this little handout I have today, it kind of goes over the variations of closings. It also talks about a hybrid e-closing, which is something that your buyers can do, just dependent on the lender. So it cuts down time, and we all know time is money and money is time. So just kind of keep that in mind with your sellers. So if you're selling a property that's in the middle of nowhere, they can hop on their laptop and sign all their closing documents. So those are my 2 tips for today on seller side. And if you guys have any questions, like always, my contact info is on there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Thanks, Russ.
Thank you. All right, so let me just get the screen share brought up here. So give me 1 second. All right, so the idea of today is we're going to go through and we're going to talk about the seller paperwork and seller packet and things. So similar to what we did on Tuesday, although on this one I'm going to go through, we'll talk about each of the sections, even if there's nothing to be filled out on it. And the idea of it, again, is having you to be able to understand the document before you're having your client sign it. And I'll tell you kind of like a story about me with that I didn't do when I first got my license. So, but before that, so for you guys on Zoom, if you have not already done it, make sure you put in the first and last name and put in your license number. I don't need the license number every single time, every one of these classes, but at least once out of the 6 for the 12-hour new agent, so that I can give you the 12-hour new agent credit. So for you guys on Zoom, if you will do that, if you haven't already. All right, so here's what we're gonna do. We're just gonna go through and talk about this, and for you guys that are on Zoom, again, I will need you to remind me probably to scroll up from time to time, or you guys can too, I guess, since you can see it, but just in case I forget. All right, so here's where I wanna start with, is I want you to notice right underneath our logo there, the Century 21 Everest, where it says exclusive right to sell, listing agreement, and agency disclosure. But right under that is the key piece. This is a legally binding contract. Read carefully before signing. So just keep in mind that this is a legally binding contract, and unfortunately, buyers and sellers tend to, like we kind of talked on Tuesday about that, people will put up, hey, the money's non-refundable earnest money, and then when they want out of the contract, then they're like, well, now how do we get the earnest money back? Well, like you don't. That's the whole point. So same thing with this is a legally binding contract. So by signing it, they're agreeing to it. So it takes 2 people to sign it. So you'll see on the last page of this, there's going to be where the seller is going to sign it, but then you are going to sign as the authorized agent for the company. So if it takes 2 signatures to get into the contract, what does it take to get out of it? That's right. So anybody that's agreed to it going in has to agree to it going out. So if the seller just calls and says, hey, I want out of my listing, we don't have to let them out because they've signed a legally binding agreement. So also, if for some reason somebody were to say, I want my attorney to look over it, obviously it's a legally binding contract, so we would want to let them do that. Now, I don't know that I've ever had anybody say, I want my attorney to look over this. I have had times where people have gotten it and then scratched stuff out and, we're not going to do this or we won't do that. But just know if that happens, we want to get a broker involved in that if they're trying to cross stuff out, just so that we make sure that it is something we want to agree to as a company. All right. So with that being said, now what we are going to go through this similar to what we did in terms of like, I'm going to explain how I would fill it out if I were you. And I'll give you some hints and things. But then, like I said, I also am going to spend a bit of time talking about each of the sections to make sure you understand it. I would recommend for you guys that you should at least one time go through and read this whole thing. So at least once, I would highly recommend that you grab a pen or a highlighter or something, and then read through this contract and highlight anything you have questions on, or write it down. And in fact, I a lot of times will recommend to people, if you have never done it, sit down and do that with a highlighter or a pen. And if you have questions, make notes on it. And then I'm happy to sit down with you afterwards and go through and explain and answer questions. But as part of today, here's how I'm going to do it. Is I typically, when I'm sitting down with either well, in this case, a seller, I usually will say to them on this contract, they basically have three options. And really, they probably have more than that. But this is how I say it to them is, you got three options. One is you could just sign it. And occasionally, that's what people want to do is, especially if it's somebody from SOI or something that knows you, a lot of times, hey, I trust you, just tell me where to sign. Okay. If they want to do that, that's fine. The other option is I can go through and explain to them what each section says, or they can read the whole thing if they want. Now, again, I tie that back to, this is a legally binding contract. So if they want to read the whole thing, I'll let them read it. Now, of those three, which one do you think gets chosen the most?
The second one.
Yeah, just tell me what it says. Tell me what I'm signing. That's generally what people will say, is just, hey, just tell me what it is that I'm signing. So the idea for me today of how I'm going to go through this with you guys is, I'm going to go through this with you the way I typically go through it with a seller. Now, we will do way more detail than what I would do with a seller, but I will start each section by telling you, here's how I explain it. Because most of the time, that's what's going to happen is the seller's just going to say, just tell me what it says, the contract. Okay. And so I'm going to do it that way so that you guys will at least have that as kind of a reference. All right. So with that in mind, so let's start here at the top. This agreement is entered into effective the blank day of month of year. So obviously you're going to put in there the effective date, the date that you're wanting the contract to become effective. So you're just going to put in, hey, if they're saying let's list it and be effective tomorrow, then we can do that. So go ahead.
I heard once they sign this, it has to be within 24 hours that you listed.
Yeah, so that's the thing that, and I feel like, to me, that's still a little bit of a gray area. And what I mean by that is, because we're saying here that it's entered and effective on whatever date. So we're agreeing that if I said it's going to be effective on Saturday, or let's say next week, Thursday, that it's actually not then in effect until then. And yet what you're saying is the board or the National Association of Realtors has come out with a rule saying you have to put it on the MLS within 24 hours of it being signed, which makes sense and it is correct. But really, I guess here's what it really is. If I put in here that I want it to be effective next Thursday, let's say, so a week from today. So I don't know what date that is, but let's just say we put that in as the date. As long as I don't do any marketing of the property, that's going to be okay, and I don't need to put it on the MLS. But here's the key thing is that rule is in place essentially to kind of make it fair for everyone. It's so that, because what people were doing, actually, by the way, where this whole thing came about is for years and years and years, it was a 5-day. You had to put it on within 5 days. Well, what agents started doing over the last, 2 or 3 years is agents would start getting the listing, wait the whole 5 days while they would go promote it on social media and try to find a buyer for the property before it even hit the MLS so they could double end it. So as a result of that is why they said now you get 1 day. So really the way that works is as soon as you start to do any marketing. So if you were going to put it on a social media or something, then you need to put it on the MLS within the 1 day. Now, so why would we have it to where you could be effective next week? Well, the idea behind this and where you're going to use that would be, I typically want to go get the photography done, the photographs before I have it hit the MLS. And so I wouldn't want to put it on here of, hey, I got this. I also don't want to go have the photographer go take pictures before they sign, because now then we're paying for something and we didn't even get the listing. So for me, that's when I'm going to do it, is I'm more dating it for a few days out. The idea being I can get the pictures ordered, the photographer can go out, take the pictures. I can then, once I get them, have it hit the MLS all at the same time. Does that make sense?
Okay, so you just can't promote it until you put it up. on
That's the
MLS,
biggest
but
thing.
If the date matches, then it's fine.
So the other option you have on that is what you do is you would date it today, have it signed today, and then you would have them sign. There's a listing exclusion form that you would have that you're saying, I've explained the benefits of the MLS, but they're choosing not to put it on the MLS until, and the idea again is all about getting the pictures done is for me. So make sense? Good questions. All right. So, and then it says that it's by and between Century 21 Everest and blank the seller. So where do we find this out? And we talked a little bit about it on Tuesday, but where am I getting who the seller is?
Listing agent? Was it the listing agent?
Well, you're going to be the listing agent on this one.
Okay, I'm looking.
So yeah, on Tuesday, I was saying get it from the listing agent for sure. But now I'm going to be the listing agent. So where do I get it?
Okay.
Tax ID, the title.
Reveille County Records.
Okay, good. So county records is one of the places. Now, here's the thing though. You cannot rely 100% on the county records. They're typically right. They're mostly right, but they're not always right. Okay. So let me tell you a quick story of that I ran into that. Now, it wasn't me personally, but it was an agent that I was training, and they had gone out and pulled up off the tax records. It showed that whatever the guy's name was the owner of the property. So the agent goes out, he has them sign the listing agreement. The market at that time was somewhat, not as crazy as it is today, but it was similar, meaning it was more of a seller's market than a buyer's market. So as a result, he gets the listing, goes, puts it on the MLS, within a day or two, gets an offer on the property. Well, in the meantime of that, so let me pause for a minute. We had Crystal here. I would highly recommend, as soon as you get this signed, go order the preliminary title report. So as soon as you get a listing agreement signed, you want to order that preliminary title report. Well, you do that, not so let's do an and instead of or. And I had said you can get it from the county records, but it's not 100% correct. I think it's a good idea to go, I would recommend for you guys to go get with the title company. So go talk to North Star and say, hey, I'm about to go list this property. Can you pull it up and tell me who's on title for it? Because here's what happens. So this agent goes out and gets the listing agreement signed by this seller, which was the guy. And a couple days later, they get an offer. Well, he had ordered the preliminary title report. And in the meantime, and I don't remember exactly all the days, but in the meantime, from when he took the listing, got the offer, the preliminary title report came in. And luckily, and we have a PR class that we'll take you guys through, but luckily, the agent had looked at to see who was on title and noticed there was another name. So the agent called me and said, what do I do? So let me ask you guys, if that were the case, what do you got to do?
Right, and see what's going on.
Yeah, we need that other, if it's got another name, that person needs to sign as well. Whoever's on title has to sign this agreement as well. So the agent says to me, what do I do? Well, you got to go find out who that is. So call the seller you had sign it, find out who this other name is, who it is, and you'll need their signature. So they're in the process, they've gotten an offer, goes out to negotiate the offer with the sellers, goes and sits down with the seller and says to the seller, okay, we got an offer, here's what the offer is, but I also noticed that it has this other name on title. Who is this person? And the guy says, oh, that's my mom. And he says, okay, well, we need your mom to sign the listing agreement. We're also going to need your mom to sign the purchase contract. Now, it wasn't that simple, or I wouldn't be telling you this story, right? So what happens is the guy says, well, my mom's on a cruise and we can't get a hold of her for a week. Okay, so now, if that's you, what are you going to do? But you got an offer sitting in front of you that's gonna expire, or lapse. It has an offer in time for acceptance that, well, you need to accept it before this time. So what are you gonna do?
Well, these days that doesn't exist because they don't even look at that. But,
Okay,
maybe an addendum or a counter offer that they have to wait.
okay, good. So that's what I said, here's what you need to do. Do a counter offer saying that, counter any terms that you're wanting to counter, but then also put in there that it's subject to whatever the mom's name was, and I don't remember, subject to her agreeing to the contract. Now, luckily we had done that, because what happens is, so they counter that back, the buyer accepts it. They start to do their due diligence. They're doing all that. A week goes by. The agent calls up the seller and says, hey, I need to get your mom's signature on the purchase contract and on the listing agreement. Is she back? And oh no, she decided to go on another cruise. So
Oh,
she's gone for another week. Agent calls, what do I do? Well, luckily we've got in the contract that it's subject to, but I would let them know you don't have signatures yet. And according to the seller, it will not be a problem. My mom will be fine to sign. Well, finally another week goes by, and I don't know if she really was on a cruise or if just the guy was trying to I don't know the details, but somehow we ended up finally, okay, we can't do anything until we get your mom's signature. Gets a hold of the mom. Guess what the mom says? Yeah, although I wouldn't be telling the story if she's like, yes, let's sign it, right? So yeah, the mom says, no way. In fact, the mom's mad, calls up our brokerage and says, what the heck is going on? Like, I'm on title for a reason. You guys signed it. You put it on the MLS. You've accepted an offer. Luckily, we had done it subject to her signing. But she was just like, no way. And she said, in fact, the whole reason I'm on title is he tried to do this once before, and it's my house. I bought it for him. He's not legally competent. And so you shouldn't even have had him be signing anything anyway. And anyway, it was a big mess. Here's the point. On this, who's the seller, make sure you're ordering that preliminary title report so that you can check to see who's on title and do you have all of their signatures. Now, I wasn't part of another one, but I heard the story from the title company that there were 7 people on title and 6 of them had signed it and the 7th didn't. And just remember, if anybody that's on title is going to have to sign the listing agreement, they also have to sign the purchase contract. And if they won't, you don't have a deal. Unless it was done like tenants in common, I guess. But.
So because she didn't sign this packet, could she like sue? Because they put it up without her signing.
Yeah, I
this?
mean, she probably, I guess, could have sued us, but there really was no damage done.
Yeah.
It really more was maybe the buyer that
Yeah.
potentially could have been, but even then, we had made it subject to her signing it, and when she came back, she wouldn't agree to it. So obviously, the buyer was upset, but it was just an unfortunate kind of all the way around thing. So, all right, good. So, and if you guys have questions on additional things, please do stop me and let's talk about them. All right, so next the terms of the listing. So section 1 here, and we're not going to read the whole thing, even though the first little bit I'm going to read it. So the seller hereby grants to the company, including blank seller's agent. So that's your name's going to go in there, right? As the seller's agent, as the authorized agent for the company, and that the agreement's going to expire or end at 5 p.m. on the blank day, month of year. So how long out should we put it? How many days, weeks, months, years? What do you think?
1 year.
1 year? Okay.
I mean, these days, 5 days is.
Probably true.
Not 5 days is a lot.
Probably true. What do you think? I've got 5 days and 1 year.
3 days?
I always do listings at 6 months, but with the current environment, maybe it should be 3 months or whatever. I don't know. What do you advise?
Okay, good. Any other thoughts? So now we have.
I always do buyers for a year. I don't care about that, but the listing 6 months.
Anyone else? 6 months. Okay. Yeah, I would say 6 months is probably the most standard number that people typically will do on the listing agreement is 6 months. But for me personally, I typically look at it and say, I want a minimum of 3 months. For me, it's just, and my thinking on that is we're gonna go be promoting it, doing all this stuff. I want to have at least 3 months. I mean, like we talked about in this current market, it's probably not as crucial. I can hear something. Sorry, I can just hear papers flipping. So, but feel free to unmute when you have questions or comments. So I would say kind of a minimum of 3 months, and really in a lot of ways, I even feel like maybe 4 is probably, I'm kind of more of, I probably do 4 more. But anyway, somewhere in that range is typically good. I mean, if you knew for sure, like, I mean, which kind of in our market we're in, you could do a 1 or a 2 month listing on it. But I just always look at it as I want to have enough time to reap the rewards of having a listing kind of a thing. So, I mean, because you do run the risk, if you only did a 1 or a 2 month, you run the risk, you get it under contract and then that contract fails and your listings run out and now they're upset at you because the deal failed and they go, wow, we're just going with somebody else. Like that's kind of more my thinking is, and not that I plan on being upset about it or anything, but I just look at it as even in a totally different market, I want a minimum of 4 months because I want to be able to get the buyer calls that are going to come off advertising the property and things in, you know, when the market changes and it's not such a commodity like it is today. So anyway, so somewhere in that range, okay? All right, and then the next blank line down, it says the real property owned by the seller described as, obviously you're just going to put in the address of the property there. So you'll have that in. Okay, good. So now let's go down to section 2 here, the brokerage fee. So keep in mind that commissions are negotiable. And for me, they're negotiable from 6% up, not 6% down, which is how a lot of agents like to do it. So for me, here's what I do. So, when we get to this with a seller, typically what I like to do, so I'll give you some ideas of what I have found is helpful in being able to get a 7, or I've done a lot of 8% listings too. So how I go about it is, so 2 things with it. One is you got to create value first. If people see value, they will pay, okay? I have a neighbor that is an appraiser, but he's also a licensed real estate agent. In fact, last night I was even talking to him and he was complaining to me, this is a commission discussion, even though it's not going to sound like it for me. He was complaining to me that he's got a buyer that they can't get an offer accepted. I mean, similar to, no surprise to what probably a lot of you are dealing with, which is you get a buyer that if they don't have a, $10, $15, $20,000 to put down to pay above the appraised value, you're probably not getting the property. And he's got a buyer like that. And he asked me, what do I do? And I said, well, here's what my recommendation is. You got to go find a property before it hits the market. Because if you can find one before it hits the market, now you have no competition. And he said, well, how do I go do that? Because now keeping in mind, he's a licensed agent, but he's a full-time, he makes all of his money off doing appraisals, and then he'll just take deals that show up along the way. Well, he said, well, how do I do that? And I said, if it were me today, I would be networking with other agents trying to find it. But the other thing I said, I would be going and knocking on doors in the neighborhoods where these people want to live, saying, I have a buyer that wants to buy a home, and would you be willing to list your house? And here's the interesting thing. This years ago, or I don't know if years, within the last couple of years, he posted something on social media about agents charging 6% commission is just ridiculous. Why would you ever do that? It's not worth it. They don't work that hard. Now, keeping in mind, he's an agent, and he said, I just never charge more than 1%. Well, within the last few months, he told me, I've gone from 1% to now I charge 2% because I can see that. And I told him, quit doing appraisals, have real estate be your sole income, and watch how fast you go to 3%. But anyway, so yesterday he says to me, well, man, I said, the nice thing is too, you go knock on the doors, now you're getting the whole commission. He goes, Well, that would go against everything I stand for. I'm like, what do you mean? He said, well, because I'm not going to charge somebody 6%. If I go knock on their door and tell them I've got a buyer, I'm not going to charge them 6%. And I said, perfect. Call me. Oh, it goes against two things that he said. One is charging them 6%, and two is I don't believe in limited agency. That would cause me to be a limited agent. I said, perfect. You go knock on the door, tell them you got a buyer, then I'll go represent him as the seller. I'll charge him 6%, and I'll only pay you 2% because that's all you're worth, and I'll keep the other 4%, right? So anyway, all right. So those are some ideas of things that just keep in mind. Like my whole point on this commission thing is a lot of agents don't think they're worth the money, and I disagree. I feel like, and here's why. In his mind, we don't do anything. Meaning, like, you put it on the MLS, and especially today's world, you put it on and the buyer shows up. But to me, I don't think that's what they're paying us for. They're not paying me to put it, because that should, if that's all it is, then go use one of these places that'll only charge you $1,200 or whatever to put it on. I mean, if that's all you get, to me, you're not paying me for that. You're paying me for what I know. And I'll share with you guys some things next on Tuesday when we do the CMA class of part of how I create the value of that I'm worth the 7 or 8%. Because to me, it's agents just don't think they're worth it. At the end of the day, the reason we have this commission issue is agents don't believe that they're worth the money. And you got to believe that you are. And so, and I'll hopefully help you with that. Okay. So the other way that I help in getting a higher commission with this, and what I've found is if you will put together a net sheet for the seller, when I'm worried about it, I do a net sheet for the seller first. And you can go down to North Star Title and you can just say to them, hey, I'm going out on a listing. Can you put together kind of an estimated seller's closing disclosure for me so that I can show them how much money they're going to walk away with? See, here's what I've found is here's the other thing. Sorry, total side note that just hit me. But I got a listing that is closing tomorrow. North Salt Lake went out there. She was hoping she could list it and sell it for $850. I got there, told her $850 will be easy and it'll probably sell for more than that. I actually made the mistake of saying it'll probably sell for $900. So then she wants to list it for $905, and I'm like, oh, I don't know. We listed it at $905 and ended up selling it for $945. So, but here's the point. Like, to me, like, especially in today's market, we should be getting a full commission because we're going to sellers who are going, yeah, if I could get $500,000 for my house, I'd be happy. And then they're getting 6. Like, shouldn't we deserve to get paid a little bit? Like, can't I get a piece of that? Like, I'm only asking for 6% of that additional $100,000 that you made. You know what I mean? Like, to me, it's like ludicrous that agents go, well, I'm not going to really have to do anything. Yeah, but I'm also going to get you an extra $50,000. So, anyway. All right, so get a seller's estimated closing disclosure from North Star. And if you just go say, you'll have to get for them, what the payoff is and all that to have it be real accurate. But even if you don't have the payoff, what I like to do is go get that estimated closing disclosure to show them here's the fees and things that are involved. Now, the reason I recommend you do it that way, I used to teach for years and years for you, and I would, at this point in the class, I would have pulled it up and let me show you how to put together a seller net sheet. And I'm happy to do that with you if you want me to individually sometime. But I've just found if you go do that, it's going to be more accurate. My first listing I ever did as an agent, I messed up. When I did a seller's net sheet for my seller, and it was my backdoor neighbor, and I messed it up. And when we got to closing, he was like, I thought we were getting X amount of dollars, and it was about $1,000 difference. And like, I felt horrible. Now, the good news is the piece that I left out that I messed up on was the reason was because of the amount of money that was in, let me back up. It was I didn't calculate the property tax, because when you close middle of the year, you're going to pay taxes from January till, tomorrow or today or whatever. And I hadn't calculated that in there when I did my seller net sheet. Now, the good news was I also hadn't calculated in his escrow account the money he had sitting in escrow. And so it balanced out, meaning it just Once they closed out his loan, then the escrow or the mortgage company sent to him, here's the money that was in your escrow account because they had already paid the taxes. So it kind of balanced out. But my point is, if you let the title company do it, they do this stuff all the time. They're not going to miss and they're going to be pretty accurate on what they get. So anyway, so that's one of the ways that I do it, but I have them put on the estimated sheet, the 7% commission or an 8%, whatever it is you're going to charge, so that when I sit down with the seller, I can say, here's basically the fees that are going to be involved in you selling your property, which means anything above whatever, if you've got their payoff, anything above that is your equity. And typically what people are doing when they're doing it is they have a number in mind of like, oh, we need to sell our house. We need to walk away with X amount of dollars. As long as that number comes in, you're going to be fine. And so that's usually what I've done. Now we get to this, okay? We get to the brokerage fee section. What happens when I sit down with them is I just am going to say to them, okay, on that closing disclosure that we had there, had a breakdown of the commissions in this. What this section is saying is that at closing, you will pay the commission, and that you're paying me to go find a ready, willing, and able buyer and help you get across the finish line. So you don't pay me anything. And I like to emphasize that. I'm working for free until I get the job done. Now, so if I don't get the job done, you're not paying me. If I get the job done, then you're going to owe me a commission, is what this section says. Okay. Now, you'll notice in here that this one is showing that it's a 7% plus a $495 acquisition fee. So let me explain that. The minimum you need to charge of the acquisition price, the administration fee, is a $295. Anything above that, and now a lot of times either brokers or recruiters, when they're explaining this, don't explain it correctly. So I always want to stop in this part of the class to make sure you guys understand it. Because I'll hear a lot of times brokers say, yeah, what I do is charge a $595 or a $695, and then it pays for a transaction coordinator to oversee the transaction, which is not totally correct, because so the first $295 of that fee goes to the company. That's just the company. Anything above the $295, so in this case, the other $200 is going to go to you based upon your split. So it's not a lot of times it's the way it gets presented, and I don't even know that I should say it's presented wrong. People's just understanding of it when it's presented is they look at it and go, oh, so I just get to keep the whole $200. No, it's on your whatever your split is. So if somebody was on a 50-50 split, you did a $495, you're getting an extra $100. Does that make sense? So the other thing on this is we've had a lot of times where people have said, well, could I charge more than that? So I've had scenarios where, like, and again, we're not in this market right now, but where the buyer has asked the seller to pay like $5,000 towards closing costs, and the lender can only use so much, but they'll use everything they can use of that. And I've had lenders come back and go, hey, we were only able to use $4,500 of the $5,000. What do you want to do with the other $500? And I have done either, typically the first thing I will do is, instead of getting a 1-year home warranty, I'll get them a 2-year home warranty and let the seller pay the additional money. Or what I've done is I've then just done an addendum to this and increased the admin fee to be a higher dollar amount to go to me, because the buyer would rather me get it than the seller get it back. And if you have a conversation, they're usually fine with that. So that's the other things. Now, so if you're ever going to do more than a $995 though, we would need to talk about it. So we had one agent actually within the company that, and I'm not lying on this, charged a 7% commission and $4,700 admin fee. And the company was kind of like, all right, that might be a little excessive admin fee. So like, here's the point, is you better be able to justify what you're doing for this admin fee if you're going to be doing more than 1,000. Like, you better have something that says, well, here's the reason we're charging more than that. So anyway, any questions on any of that?
I think it's all how you present it, because You know, I've gone up as high as 1,000 and, you know, compared to what's going on across the nation here in Utah, we don't charge very much.
Yeah.
And in that fee, I mean, if you're paying for someone to process the transaction and everything, you're paying for the franchise fee, you're paying for all of your time and everything. Nothing goes in your pocket until you've at least chipped away that much and you're still getting dinged. And so I think it's totally how you present it and your attitude.
Perfect, yes. And in fact, it's interesting because over the years so I've been training now for a number of years. It's been interesting over the years how it used to be like when I said to you guys, do you have any questions? It used to be that the whole class would be like, well, what's this 495? Like, what is that? And I would literally spend a half an hour helping people understand it. And it's kind of interesting of like, you guys kind of almost just seem like, oh, okay. And not just you, but over the last couple of years, it's kind of just become, okay. So like, not like, why did we do that? Because it's already seemed like 7% is kind of high or whatever. But the idea behind it, just kind of so you guys know where this whole thing came from of charging an additional on top of it, is over the years, it has become so competitive, commissions have, meaning when I first started, nobody got higher than an 80% ever. Like the whole idea of caps didn't exist. Nobody capped, meaning you would pay at least 20% of the commission. It didn't matter how many transactions you did, anything. But over the years, the market has become so competitive and brokerages started buying basically agents by saying, we'll give you 100%. We'll only charge you up to, however much, $21,000. And then after that, you'll go to 100%. And so as a result of it, companies had to figure out a way to still make money. And so that's how this got, and where it actually came from was agents within companies were doing it, charging it. Like typically it was the bigger hitters that had 2 or 3 assistants would charge their clients a fee on top of that as a way of saying basically, hey, when you hire me, you get a whole team of people. And as a result of that, you're gonna have to pay an extra, back then it was like $200, an extra $195. And companies started noticing, hey, all these agents are doing it and they're getting away with it. And so it was kind of a way for companies to say, we still got to be able to make money if we're giving it all away to the agents. So I usually say, if you ever want to decide to get rid of this, just make sure you never have a cap and never get higher than 80% split. And every broker out there would say, yep, I'll never make you charge that if you'll do that. And usually once I explain that, agents are like, no, I'm good with it. All right. So we good on the brokerage fee? Any other questions on that? Okay, good. All right, next, protection period. If within blank months after the termination or expiration of the agreement, so what this section says is, and this is how I explain it to the seller. This section is keeping honest people honest. This is how I'm telling you, this is how I tell the seller. The purpose of this protection period is to keep honest people honest. So basically what it's saying is if you sell the home within however many months we put in here, so we'll talk about that in a second. But if they sell the home within blank number of months after the expiration of this agreement, that anybody that we showed the property to buys it during that protection period, we still get paid a commission. So the idea of that is, what it's there for is to protect, let's say that this listing agreement was going to expire tomorrow and a buyer goes and looks at the house today, it would protect us from the seller pulling them aside and saying, hey, if you wait till tomorrow, we won't have to pay a commission, I'll give you 3% off the price. Like that's the idea of what this does for us, is to do that. So with that in mind, how many months what should we put on that blank line?
3 months.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
I'd say 6.
6 months?
6 months.
6, okay. Good. So there's not a right answer on this. Here's how I just say to think of it is, think of it for yourself How much time would you want to be protected that if somebody goes through and purchases? Now, our contract, which this is actually a good point to let me point out. You'll notice this contract is the Century 21 Everest listing agreement. You can get a listing agreement off of the MLS, but there is a difference between the MLS's listing agreement and ours. And not a lot of difference, but there's a few differences. One of the differences being here on this protection period, what it says here is, in fact, let me just read this one to you. If within blank months after the termination or expiration of the listing agreement, the property is acquired by any party to whom the property was offered or shown by the company, the seller's agent, the seller, or another real estate agent during the listing period, or any extension of the listing period, the seller agrees to pay the company the brokerage fee stated in section 2. So now notice what we're basically saying is if we threw in there 1 month or 3 months or 6 months, that if anybody buys it that looked at it during that time, we're still owed a commission. Now, on the one that you would print off from the MLS, it says the same thing, only after where it says section 2 on here, and it's probably not worded exactly the way I'm saying it, but it says, comma, unless listed with another brokerage. So on the MLS one, it's saying you're protected unless they go list it with somebody else. Ours is saying we get paid. Now, here's the truth though. I don't think we've ever gone after, I might be wrong, but I don't think we've ever, if this expires and they go list with somebody else, I don't think we've ever gone after the commission to collect it. But it gives us the chance to, I guess is kind of the point, is our contract here is going to give you a little bit extra protection than what the MLS does. So that's, I would highly recommend you use ours, not the MLS. Okay. All right. So on that, if within blank months, 6 is fine. Here's what I would just say. Don't do 0. I see agents put 0 in there, which you can put 0, but you're essentially wiping out that whole section of the contract if you put 0. And even though you might think, like what I just said, I don't know that we've ever gone after it. So some agents might look at it, well, then why even worry about it? 0. There are times when it potentially could be though that you go, hey, no, I want to make sure. So for me, I would say at least put a month there, but I usually do 2 or 3 is kind of the, thing that I do. There's not a right answer. 6 is fine too. All right, section 4, seller's warranties and disclosures. So when I get to this section with the sellers, what I'm just telling them is, here's how I explain it to them. This section is where you are warranting that you will have the right to be selling the property. So remember the story I told you back up at the top there about the seller that he signed it but didn't tell that his mom was on title and we didn't get her signature. I mean, essentially, this section is, they're saying, I'm warranting to you, I have the right to be selling the property. So let's go back for a minute up to that seller line. What if the property is in the name of a trust? If that's the case, then who has the right to sell the property?
I put the name of the trust and the person.
Okay, but how do you know who the person is?
Well, I asked the person who's named in the trust.
Okay, good. So yeah, so what we would put up at the top is the name of the trust. And then what we want though, and I always just tell them the title company is going to need it anyway, but what we want is a copy of the trust where it shows who can sign on behalf of the trust. Okay. So down here in section 4 is they're warranting that what this section is telling us is they're warranting to us, they have the right to be selling the property. Okay. So that's the first piece of it. So what I'm explaining is I'm just telling them this section is saying you're guaranteeing us basically you have the right to sell the property. And the disclosures piece of this is where I will tell them you're also agreeing that you will fill out seller disclosures. Now we've got some in the packet here that we'll get to in a little bit. But typically, if I'm sitting down with a seller and I'm going through this with them, right then is when I will pull out these seller disclosures and I will say to them, here are the seller disclosures, and in this section, you are warranting and agreeing that you'll fill these out and disclose everything you know about the property. So I'll say more about the seller disclosures when we get there, but just know when I'm explaining to the seller what they're signing, they're agreeing they have the right to sell the property and that they will disclose everything they know about the property. Make sense? All right. Section 5. Section 5 is the agency relationship section. So there's a couple things the division wants me to make sure I cover in terms of this. In terms of your fiduciary duties, essentially what this section is talking about, the agency relationship, is explaining to them that here's in 5.1, here's the duties of a seller's agent. And then it goes through and basically lists them out. And then 5.2 is the duties of a limited agent. Now, again, the way that I handle this when I get to this section is I just tell the seller what this section is saying is that I'm on your side, that we're not adversaries in getting your home sold, even though a lot of times a seller might feel like you're not there to help them, you're like their adversary in it. Like I tell them, we're not adversaries. What this section is saying is I'm putting my interest of my own personal interest under yours. So I started to say that backwards. I'm putting my interest above yours. No, I'm putting their interest above mine. So whatever is going to be best for them is what I have to do. So if you think about what you learned in real estate school about your fiduciary duties, this is essentially saying I'm on your side. Now, and then I tell them in terms of limited agency, here's how I say it. In the event somebody were to call me off the sign, do you want me to be able to show the property? And what are they going to say? Yeah, we want you to. Great. What this section is saying is that in the event that happens, I can't take sides. I have to stay neutral. So I just tell them this duties of a limited agent basically just say, I've got to be neutral. I can't lean more towards you or towards them. So, and ultimately, here's how I explain it to them is I say, what it means is if they told me the most they would be willing to pay to buy your house, I can't tell you that. But if you told me the least you would accept, I can't tell them that either. Does that make sense? Now, I've only had this happen one time, but it was very awkward. I ended up being a limited agent on a listing, and the seller had told me, we will not accept an offer below X. And I don't remember how much below list price was, but it was kind of a weird number. I had somebody call me off the sign. I went and showed the property, and they said, we want to write an offer. I said, okay. We sat down to write the offer, and I said, how much do you want to offer? And guess what they said? Exactly the amount that the seller said was their bottom dollar. And I was like, and it was something like it was, ended in a 57.5 or something, and they were kind of like that. And that was the most awkward going and presenting it because I'm like, I know this is going to look weird, but I promise you I did not tell. And I didn't. I hadn't said anything, but anyway. So I just explaining to them, I'm on your side. I'm there to help you. I'm going to negotiate for you. I'm going to try anything I know. I'm going to tell you, unless I'm a limited agent, and then I have to stay neutral. But if there's another agent involved, meaning if they said, well, no, I don't want you to be a limited agent yet. And I say, okay, well, so in the event somebody calls me, I'll hand it to one of my associates. I'll give it to Mary. And if they want to write an offer, guess what? I'm not going to know what the most they're willing to pay is. So it really kind of doesn't do any good to not be a limited agent. And in fact, I've found acting as a limited agent, the agent on the other side of the transaction is so much easier to work with. Sit on me. But seriously though, I mean, I say that jokingly, but there are so many times that honestly, agents are the ones who get in the way of a transaction happening. An agent's ego gets in the way of a deal's coming together. And I've just found when it's just me there, like when I'm representing both sides, that doesn't happen, obviously. So anyway, I kind of joke about it, but it really is, there's a lot of truth to that of agents get in the way because they want to look cool to their seller or whatever. So, all right, next. So we're going to page 2 now. We only spent 50 minutes, so that's good. Usually I spend an hour.
Is there somewhere where they can write that they don't want limited agency at all? To make sure.
Good question. I've actually never had somebody, I've had people at first be like, oh, I don't know if we want to do that. But when I explained it to them, like what I just did, I've never had anybody not. So in the event you did, yes. And I'll show you when we get there, what you would do, okay? All right, so turn the page. Let's go to page 2. All right, on page 2 is section 6 is the expiration. Now, this section does not exist on, unless they've changed it, but it didn't for years. And I'm assuming it still doesn't. If you use the MLS's listing agreement, this section's not in, okay? So section 6 says the expiration date of this contract will automatically extend to the closing date if the property is under contract. When the property is pending / under contract, seller instructs seller's agent not to present any more offers. So here's what happens with this. So let's say that we had done this as a 6-month listing. In month 5, we got an offer and it got accepted, but it wasn't going to close until after the expiration date of this. This section is saying automatically, because we just put the property under contract, the expiration date just changed to whatever the closing date is. That way, even if we had to go later on and do an addendum to extend the settlement deadline, this is extending as well. So it saves you from having to go get something signed saying that you are extending the expiration. Make sense? The other thing that is key on here is you learned in real estate school, what do you have to do with any written offer that's given to you? Yeah, any offers that are given to you in writing have to be presented to your seller. Well, you'll notice on here, it's that very last piece says seller instructs seller's agent not to present any more offers. So that now gets us out of having to go do that. Now, why would we want that in? I mean, typically you would think, well, why would you not want to see any other offers?
Because when you have 40 offers.
Yeah, exactly. That's true too. So I guess that's a good point, Rebecca. In today's market, it does apply as well. But when this got added was back 2008, 9, and 10, somewhere in that range, when there was a ton of short sales. And what was happening is you would go write an offer, you'd get it accepted. They would then go present it to the bank to get it approved for a short sale. And then if another offer showed up and you have to go present it and you got to start all over again, and it just delayed so many things. And so the idea of this was to just get it to where, okay, once we've got an offer accepted, we've got the seller agreement, we don't have to present any others, okay? So that will show up again. We have it twice in here, actually. All right, section 7. So section 7 is professional advice. Here's how I explain this to the clients. And I usually do it more as a joke, but this is how I do it. So remember I told you, I'm just going to explain to you guys how I do it. When I get to this section, I tell them section 7 says, don't trust anything I tell you. And usually they're like, what? and then I just say, no, really what it says, if you look at what is all in caps in there, it says seller is advised not to rely on the company or any of the agents of the company for a determination regarding the physical or legal condition of the property. Okay. And then the other all caps says, strongly recommended that the seller obtain such independent advice. If the seller fails to do so, the seller is acting contrary to the advice of the company. So basically what I tell them is this. I always start it with this section says, don't trust anything I tell you. And then they usually give me a funny look. And then I say, no, ultimately what it's saying is a lot of times people will think that I know everything there is to know about surveys, or that I know everything there is to know about water rights, or that I know everything about the physical condition of the property or taxes, like all that kind of stuff. Is what this section is saying is I'm trained in the marketing of real estate. I'm not trained in all this other stuff. So don't rely on me. Now, the reason I like to do that, and you do it more so with a buyer than a seller, but the reason I like to do it is because then down the road, when they say to me, hey, are we going to have to pay capital gains taxes? I can go back to them. Remember that section that said, don't trust anything I tell you? Oh yeah, we forgot about that. That is when I usually go, this is one of those scenarios. I can tell you what I think, but based on that, don't rely on me. You know, and I will say, look, like, so if they were asking if I might have to pay capital gains, remember that section that says don't trust me?
But my understanding of it is if you've lived there 2 out of the last 5 years, you won't have to pay capital gains. But don't rely on me. Talk to your accountant to find out for sure. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Section 8. What's up, Danette? You can come in. You're fine. I just want to call you. All right. Section 8 is dispute resolution. And when I get to this section, I just tell them what this section says is if a dispute arises between who? Who would this contract be concerned about a dispute? Between which parties?
Seller?
Yeah, the company and the seller, okay? So this is saying, in the event that a dispute arises, remember yesterday or Tuesday, we talked about shall or may? Notice, shall. So on this one, if a dispute arises between the company and the seller, we shall first go to mediation, okay? So we're going to mediation first. And then I go drop from there down to section 9 and say, in the event that mediation doesn't work, that the prevailing party is entitled to reasonable attorney's fees that take place, okay? So that's what I just tell them, look, if there's a dispute, we're first going to go to mediation. If we do end up in court, the prevailing party is entitled to reasonable attorney's fees is what this says. All right, section 10. Section 10 is advertising / seller authorization. So when I get to this section, I tell them what this section says is you're giving us permission to advertise the property and you're authorizing us to hold open houses and do those kinds of things. So for you guys, we're going to run through the list here just because I want to make sure you're aware of what they are giving us. So you'll see here on 10A is that they're giving us permission to disclose to the MLS after closing the final terms and sales price of the property consistent with the requirements of the MLS. Just a B, which I don't know why B starts there instead of down below, but B, disclose to the MLS the square footage of the property as obtained from, and then it's got these check boxes. Now, here's the thing. The Division of Real Estate requires that the seller disclose to 2 people where they got the square footage from. So one of them is here. So who would that be disclosing to? Yeah, to us. So the seller has to disclose to us where they got the square footage from. Now here's the ironic thing. Where do they usually get the square footage from? Well, no, where does the seller get it from? Who gives it to them? Yeah, that's the ironic thing, is it's usually us that gets it and gives it to the seller, and then here the seller has to tell us where we got it from to give it to them. Does that make sense? Like that's, yeah, whatever. But so they have to disclose where they got the square footage. So you're either checking the box for county records, an appraisal, building plans, or others. So now occasionally, if they have an appraisal, I will do that. So for you guys, here's the thing. I will usually ask because yes, there may be a previous MLS or I've gotten it off of the county records, but I like to ask them if they have an appraisal or building plans. Because notice we can choose any of those. And if one of them shows the square footage being bigger than the county records, like if they've got an appraisal that says the square footage is blah, I'm going to use that instead of the county records. Does that make sense? So I will usually ask, but then you're going to just check the box for where you got it. Okay. So who do you think the other person, the seller, would have to disclose where they got the square footage from? Yeah, to the buyer. And so where do they do that? Stay tuned and we'll get there. All right.
On the MLS.
Nope, it's not the MLS actually. All right, section 10C. Obtain financial information from any lender or any other party holding a lien. So they're giving us permission or authorization to do this. To have a key to the property is D. E is to have an MLS or local board of realtors approved key box installed. And then it also says if the seller authorizes us to, if the seller authorizes the broker or the seller's agent to install a non-MLS board of realtors approved endorsed security key box on the property, seller acknowledges that it may not provide the same level of security. So basically they're giving us permission to use one of our board lock boxes, But if we also want the seller to know if we put a different one on there, they are not going to have the same level of security. Okay. F is that we can hold open houses. G, place for sale, sold, or similar signs on the property. H, order a preliminary title report. I, order a home warranty plan if applicable. So they're actually just giving us permission here to order a home warranty plan. J, communicate with the seller for the purposes of soliciting real estate related goods. So that gets us around the do not call list, basically. K is to place the earnest money into an interest-bearing account, which we don't do. We looked into it, actually. We wanted to do it, but there was so much red tape that we decided not to. So we don't do that. L is when the property is pending or under contract, seller instructs seller's agent to not present any more offers. So we talked about that already up in section 6. And then M, in the event that the buyer's agent requests to present an offer in person to the seller gives written authorization to the designated listing agent of the brokerage to decide if the offer will be presented in person or not. See, when I first started, every offer you would go meet with the seller. You would write the offer with the buyer. You would then go show up at the seller's house. And a lot of times I would bring my buyer with me. They would be in the car. I'd get out of the car. I would go and knock on the door. The listing agent would be there with the seller. We'd walk in. I would hand a copy of the offer to the listing agent. I would sit down with the seller and I would say, let me tell you about my buyer. You know, blah, blah, blah. They're moving for here from there. This is that, blah, blah, blah. And this is their first house. And they just love your house. And here's what they're offering. And here's when we want to close. And I would go through the offer with them. And then I would turn to the listing agent and say, do you have any questions? And they would say, nope, let us talk about it. And I'd say, okay, great. We'll be out in the car. And I'd go walk out. And we'd sit in the car and I'd tell them, oh yeah, they looked like they were pretty excited about the price and blah, 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 whatever. And the seller agent would sit down with the seller in there and they'd go, okay, what do you want to do? And then they would write up a counter offer. And not always would we do it right at the same time, but a lot of times I did it that way because I just didn't want to have to deal with it. But they would write up a counter offer and then they would come out. I would get out of the car. The listing agent would tell me, all right, here's what they're countering and here's why they're countering. Then I'd get back in the car and I'd tell my buyers, okay, here's what they countered and this is what they want to do. What do you want to do? Oh, let's counter it again. So I'd do a counter. I'd go knock on the door. Hey, here's our counter and this is what we did. Like we would put together deals like right then, which was awesome. But what this section is saying is if somebody wants to come present an offer, which really actually I think is a good idea, even in today's market, if it were me, if I were you guys, I would try to say to the listing agent, I want to come present my own offer. I want to sit down with the seller and do it. Like it's a little bit extra work, but I think it goes a long ways. So I would try to do it. But this section says it's up to us. If somebody were to call you and say, I want to come present, this is saying the seller has authorized you to decide if you should do that. Make sense? All right. Section 11, personal property. So this section here, when I get to this one, what I'm telling them is that basically what it says is that we're not responsible if something gets stolen or damaged, okay? But I also, when I get to this section, here's how I handle it. I tell the seller, this section says we're not responsible if something gets stolen or damaged, but also similar to what we talked about on Tuesday, I will tell them, if you have things in the home that you're worried about that with, drugs, guns, money, like, and I usually say drugs, joking, but could be prescribed too. But if you have drugs, guns, money, a shelf on the wall, the things that you don't want them to have, get them out of the property before we list it. So when I get to that personal property section, I'll usually explain it. Now, a few years ago, I had an agent who had come through this class, called me one day and said, hey, my seller had these office fridges, like one you would have here at your desk, like the small ones. The seller had one of those in their bedroom. And he said he keeps $600 in cash in that refrigerator. Somebody showed the house, and when he got home, the $600 was gone. And he said, he called me and he's mad. Okay. So I said, well, did you explain to him section 10 of the, or 11 of the listing agreement? Well, yeah, I told him that we weren't responsible. Okay, well, there's his answer. Like we told you, don't leave that kind of stuff laying around. we're not going to give them the money back. I said, now with that, I said, you know, call the buyer's agent and tell them, hey, there's $600 missing. And he thinks you took it or whatever. But ultimately, I just always want to tell them, look, you're responsible to safeguard your valuables. If you have them, if you're worried about it, get them out of the property. And same thing, if you've got things you don't want them, like a shelf or whatever, get it out before we list it. Make sense? All right, next page, section 12, attachment. Now, so Mary asked earlier about what if somebody doesn't want limited agency? The contract says we can do it. Which, by the way, one of the other things I forgot to tell you, that one of the other things that I say to them, when we get to that is I always tell them in that section, this is probably the reason I never have anybody have a problem with it, is when I explain to them limited agency, and look, it's really not any different. In fact, it's better because I don't have to deal with the ego of the other agent. But I tell them, if you're worried about it though, the good news is before we enter into it, there's another form I'm going to have you sign before we do it. So if you're unsure now, let's just go ahead and sign it and be okay with it, because you'll have the chance later on to tell me no. And they go, okay. Now, with that though, in the event they said, nope, I still don't want to do it, then the best way to do it would be section 12 here. In section 12, you would check the box of that there are additional terms contained, and then you would do an addendum to the listing agreement. Okay. So the other times, it's pretty rare. Most of the time you're going to check are not. If you're working for sale by owners or, well, typically for sale by owners more so. If you were working for sale by owners and you went out to talk to a for sale by owner and they said, well, yeah, I want to list my home with you, but I've got these two people that said they might want to buy the house. So I want to wait and see if they're going to buy it. Typically what I would do is say, let's exclude those people. Let's go ahead and get it listed. We'll exclude those people from the contract for the next 30 days or 45 days or whatever. Then what I would do is on section 12, I would check the R box. There are additional terms, get an addendum to the listing agreement and put the following people are excluded from this contract for the next 30 days, and then list the names of the people. Then if they get an offer from one of those people, they don't have to pay us a commission. Make sense? So pretty rare that you're going to use that though. Most of the time you're going to just check there are not additional terms and go on. All right. Section 13 is equal housing opportunity. So when I get to this section, I always just tell them basically what it says is exactly the sentence. You're going to follow all the federal and state laws regarding fair housing. You're not going to discriminate against somebody from buying your house because you don't like any of the protected classes there. Okay? Make sense? And people go, okay, but I just don't want any blah, fill in the blank to buy my house. Yeah, no, this says you can't do that. So, all right. Section 14 is electronic transmission and counterparts. What this one is saying is that we're agreeing that we can email, and it says, and fax, which, when's the last time you sent a fax? Interestingly, I actually within the last year had to get one sent, and I like walked all over the office, and I was like, where do we do a fax? How do we don't even have a fax machine. We don't have one in our Century. I had to go to the mortgage company to Inspiro. Inspiro so if you need to fax anything, go to Inspiro. All right. But we're agreeing we can do that in transmissions or counterparts. What's counterparts? Any idea? And I don't expect
It's a copy of a copy. Like if it's not the original, you're getting a fax of a fax of it,
Okay, good. Yeah. So typically because of how we do it now with .loop, we don't run into counterparts too much. But back when we were doing faxes, what would happen is I would get an offer. We would talk to the sellers. They'd say, yeah, we want to do it. And I'd say, okay, let me fax it to you. I'd fax one to the husband, fax one copy of it to the wife at work. They were both at work. They would sign it and fax it back. Well, I've got both their signatures on the same document. I mean, it's not the exact piece of paper, but it's the same document. That's what counterparts. So they both aren't signed on the same piece of paper, but they both signed the same document or a copy. Does that make sense? So this is agreeing we could do that. So if you ever, it's potential you could run into that sometime, somewhere. I don't know how, why, but you could. And if you did, that's saying it's okay. All right. Section 15 is due on sale. This section, when I get to this one, what I say to them is unless you're planning on selling your home with seller financing or a lease option, you don't have to worry about it. But if you are, so for me, this is the section that when I get to it, I ask them, do you need the cash out of your house? Or would you be willing to seller finance the home to people? Now, here's the thing. This section's in here and probably really 999 times out of 1,000, and maybe even less than that, are you going to ever run into an issue with you doing this? Meaning, most of the time you're going to go list a property in this section you really don't need to worry about. But I could foresee down the road interest rates going up, and we're going to have all these people who have a sub 3% interest rate that 5 or 10 years from now want to sell their house, and they've got an interest rate that's 2.875. Those could become where we start doing some seller finance type stuff when we get there. So, but for now, just know this is saying certain types of transactions could trigger this due on sale clause. And if we're just doing a traditional normal sale, you don't have to worry about it. But if you're going to do seller finance, it could be an issue. Okay? All right. Next one is FIRPTA, or the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax. Now, this section I love because it just tells us how screwy our government is. Okay, what this says, and this is how I explain it to the seller. Here's what this section says: if you as a seller are a foreign investor, meaning they're from another country and they own real estate here, and they sell the property and don't have if you're a foreign investor, you're going to have a tax ID number. You're not going to have a social security number, right? So if they're a foreign investor and they don't have a tax ID number and they sell this property, the buyer, if they don't get a tax ID number from the seller, has to pay the taxes. Isn't that screwy? So if the sellers cheats the system, so to speak, and the buyer doesn't catch them, the buyer gets to pay the taxes, basically. That's what it says, which is kind of screwy. So, when I get to this section, I am asking the seller, or explaining to the seller, this section is saying if you're a foreign investor, you need to have a tax ID number. So essentially for the sellers, they either need a social security number or a tax ID number to sell the property, basically, is what it is, okay? So then we're gonna check the box there that the seller either is or is not a foreign person as defined in section 1445 of the Internal Revenue Code, which I don't know how they define it, but they're saying they either is or they is not a foreign person. And if they are, then we need a forwarding address. And as long as we do that, so ultimately the way the law really is written on this is that the seller, the buyer is responsible to get the seller's tax ID number or to make sure that the title company gets it from them. So really the title companies now are on top of this to where you really don't have to worry about it. But for a while there, when this first came into being, which the act was amended in 2008 when the mortgage crisis basically happened. And so they amended it in 2008, which is what put it in play. And there was a title company up in Park City that ended up having to pay like $35,000 to the IRS because they didn't collect from the buyer, or excuse me, the seller, a tax ID number. It was a foreign investor. Okay. All right. So that's what that. Section 17 says this is the entire agreement, that anything that's not in writing here is not enforceable, basically. So I always just tell them anything we've agreed to has to be put in writing. Okay. So that I've seen scenarios where an agent, in fact, I sat in on a professional standards within the last year, actually. I did a professional standards for an agent out of Cedar City that the seller had filed a complaint against them. And their biggest complaint was the agent had said, you can cancel this contract at any time, but never put it in writing anywhere. And section 17 is basically saying that if it's not written anywhere, it's not part of the agreement. And her whole complaint was, He said he would cancel at any time. I tried to cancel and he wouldn't let me. And after we listened to it, we said, yeah, why didn't you put it in writing? Because he said, no, I agreed to do that. I agreed that I would do it. Okay, well, why didn't you put it in writing? So ultimately what we fined him for was not putting it in writing. All right, then the seller's gonna sign. You will sign as the authorized agent, but before you turn the page, notice that in red here, it says, do you have a real estate need, a property sale or purchase outside of the market area or the state of Utah, yes or no? Always stop and ask that question of them. It's just a great way for you to find out if you could send an outgoing referral. And you just would call up here to the front desk for our relocation department, and you can send them as an outgoing referral. And then hopefully you'll get paid. On average, it's about $1,000. So make $1,000 for just referring them to somewhere else. Make sense? All right, next page. This next page here, uh-oh. You're probably reading the document. Okay, sorry guys, I'm on Zoom. I gotta pull that back up again here. Let's see. I don't know what happened. All right. I think we're good to go again. All right, sorry about that. I don't know what happened. All right, so the next document is the residential listing input form. Now, on this, here's the key thing. So I'm going to go through this one somewhat quickly, but just a couple of things that I want to point out to you. You'll notice here, right next to where it says list price. Use my mouse up there. It's got this little dot, and then down here, short sale, there's a dot. But you'll notice over here, lease considered, there's no dot. Down here, unit number, no dot. Under the street name, there is a dot. Here's the key. Anywhere on this form, the 6 pages of this form, that there is a dot is a required field. So you should know the answer to any of those with a dot. If you don't, if there's not a dot, like lease considered and there's no dot, you can leave it blank or not check a box, whatever. But as you go through this form, just pay attention to any place that has one of those dots is it required. You should know the answer to that question. And if you don't, then you need to find out to be able to put it on the MLS, okay? Now, kind of glance through this and then let me know if you have questions on it, but essentially you're just gonna go through and fill this out. Now, you can do it one of 2 ways. One is just printing this and filling it out. Or the other way is on the MLS, you can do, click the button on to start a new listing or input a new listing, whatever. And you can fill it out electronically which is, that's my preferred method of doing it is, and I would recommend for you to do it that way. Because and then you could just print the PDF if you wanted to actually sign it. But it's gonna make it quicker to get it on the MLS if you do that, okay? All right, so I'm gonna scroll through here. There's a couple things that I do wanna point out. But you'll just enter in school information, the tax information, the property, the style, your bill, all of this kind of stuff. Once you get down to here is where you're gonna put the square footage for each of the levels, which level has the master bedroom on it. Each level, what it's a full bath, a 3/4, or a half bath. You're just gonna kind of fill all this stuff out. You get down to here, there's a spot for check boxes where you can go through and check the boxes. So let me kind of tell you how I do it. I usually fill this out as best as I can on the computer. Then when I'm going to go out and meet with the seller to just look at the property or do the listing presentation, I'm going to print it off. As I walk through the property, I will then check the boxes as I notice things. But here's the other thing that I'll do is I will have the seller then take a look at this form before I leave the house and just say, here's how I say it. You know your house better than I do. Take a look at this and see what I've missed. Notice I didn't say, see if I missed anything. I always say it as, take a look at this and see what I've missed. And then we can check the boxes that I missed because you're gonna miss them, okay? All right, so I fill all this out. And then down here, so there's a couple things I do want to talk about. So under the listing information here, so you're going to fill all this out, or on the MLS, it'll auto-fill it because you're logged in. But under here on listing type, you've got, notice it's got the circle, the dot. So you have to check one or the other of these. So what is EAL and what's ERS? Which one do we check? Yeah, good. ERS is exclusive right to sell. What's EAL? Yeah, good. Exclusive agency listings. What does that mean? That's right. The exclusive agency means only our brokerage can sell the property. ERS is anybody can. So you're almost always going to check the ERS box. Okay. Next one down is it asks about dual or variable rate. You have to check either yes or no. What would that mean? Dual or variable rate? All right. I'll help you. Basically, let me tell you how I learned about this, although I didn't know that this is what it was referring to. I had an agent in my office that actually did a lot of the training for me when I first started, meaning he was kind of the guy I would always go to. His name was Bob. I would go to Bob and be, hey, what do you do with this? How do you do that? What do you do with this? And one day he was telling me that when he goes on, I shouldn't tell you this. Don't do what I'm about to tell you, but this is what he would do. He would tell me he would go to his listing, and at his listing, he would tell the sellers, if I end up representing the buyer, so if I end up being a limited agent, I'll only charge you 5% commission. So he would say it's a 6% commission, unless I'm going to be representing the buyer, then it's only 5%. Well, in that case, on the MLS, you need to check the box of, yes, there's a dual or a variable rate. So the idea of this, when you see it on the MLS, if you see somebody's checked the box for dual or variable, what they're telling you is the commission could be different. Meaning, so let's say that I had said that. For Bob, let's say he had done that. That if I end up representing the buyer, it's only a 5% commission. Well, so Bob has a buyer for the property, but then I write an offer on the property as well. We both write it for full price. Bob's offer is better than mine, even though they're exactly the same, because he's already agreed to take a lesser commission. Okay. Now, why, for me, part of it is, why do I need to know that? Like, I don't know that I need to, other than, I guess it just lets me know that even though we offered the same exact thing and it closed, when I see it close and it's like, hey, we offered even $50 more or whatever, this is letting you know, yeah, there may have been something else in play with it, okay? So most of the time, I would say you're going to check no on that there's not a dual or variable rate. And then the last thing on this that I'll hit on is the compensation offered, the BAC. Is it going to be off of?
Can I ask a question on that?
Yes.
it doesn't really help you though, because you're not gonna be able to dig down and find out what
Right.
that rate is unless you get the guy to disclose it and he, so
Right.
what I'm saying is, I guess we can't fret over it.
Right, no, I totally agree with what you're saying, Rebecca, because to me, I'm kind of like, okay, so I know there's a dual variable rate, so it's probably not gonna change anything, so, all right. So, okay, next is the compensation offer, and then it's got gross or net. So the difference on that, gross would mean you're getting paid off whatever the purchase price is. Net is going to mean which we're not in this market anymore. But in the event that a buyer were to show up and say to the seller, I want you to pay $5,000 in closing costs. So let's just say purchase price was $300,000 and the buyer said, I need you to pay $5,000 in closing costs. Your commission would be based on $295, not $300, if it's net. That makes sense? So I always just say, just do gross.
But it shows up a lot with builders.
Yeah, oh, that's true. Where builders will do it is if they won't pay the commission on, what's the word?
Upgrades, on the upgrades.
They won't-
So you could have $100,000 of upgrades and you're not getting paid on that. But I kind of feel like, I mean, I've been able to negotiate where I was paid on that, but I also feel that it's money out of your client's pocket. So.
Yep.
I don't know.
Okay, good. So this is all the check boxes again, which like I say, I typically am just doing those as I walk through the property, but at the end I'll say, will you look through these and see which ones I've missed? And then they'll look through it and go, oh, we have a porch lift. Okay, great. Check the box. Like that's kind of how I do this. Okay. All right. Go to the page that has remarks on it. Okay. Now, here's what I do when I get to this one. When I get to this page and I'm filling this out with the seller, or just before I leave the home, I will always say to the seller, what things do you want me to make sure that we highlight in the remarks section? Meaning, like we've checked all these boxes, and that's part of why I have them go through and look at it. Anything that's checked on there is going to show up as the MLS. What other things would you want me to highlight in the remarks section? And then here's what I've found. And let me tell you the whole reason I started to do this is it used to be like for me from day one of my very first listing, I hate writing the remarks section. I hate it because I'm like, I just am not good at writing flowery remarks, whatever. And then here's what I found is I would usually go on and read a bunch of people's from the MLS and then I'd be like, ooh, I like that. So I would just write it, some version of how they had written. Well, what would happen though is then it would hit the MLS and then the seller would call me and be like, hey, you didn't mention in the remarks, blah, 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 whatever. And so what I did is and I don't even know where I got this idea, but I one day went to the seller and I just said, hey, what things do you want me to make sure that I put in? And I've had times where they're like, oh, well, give it to me and I'll just write it in there. And then essentially they write the remarks for you. Even if they don't actually physically write them, they'll tell you, oh, well, make sure that you mention that we've got this cool wallpaper that says C21 on it, or whatever. And I go, okay, and then I'll put wallpaper C21. And they, make sure you point out that the garage is extra wide. Okay, great. Here's what I found happen. If I do that, when they look at it on the MLS, they read the remarks, they're like, oh, it's awesome. You did such a great job. Well, yeah, it's because I made them do it, basically. But if they ever did call me after that, it wasn't to call me to say you forgot. The phone call was like this. Hey, Russ, I forgot to tell you to put in the remarks. See, all of a sudden it wasn't me, it was their fault now. So anyway, that's one of the things I like to do is just say to them, hey, what things do you want to have? I have heard of some agents will even say, hey, have the seller write up the remarks you want to see and email it to me, and then they just copy and paste it. Do that. All right, agent remarks. The agent remarks section is going to be just for you to put anything you want agents to know. So that if you don't want the general public to know, but you want an agent to know, put it there. Okay. And then not directions or non-standard, whatever it says under their address. In today's world with GPSs, most of the time you don't need to really put anything. But I actually sold a cabin up Big Cottonwood Canyon here that when you plugged in the address to the GPS, it drove you to the wrong cabin. So I used this section to be able to say, when you plug it into the GPS, the cabin that you land, that it's going to drive you to is not the right one. You need to go to the one to the right or whatever. So that would be used in that type of a scenario. Exclusion remarks would be for you to put anything about just that you're wanting to exclude, and HOA, obviously, anything you want to explain about the HOA. Okay. All right, and then they're going to sign this page and on to the property disclosure. Condition disclosure. Okay.
So I have a question, and maybe you're going to hit it in situation, but I may not have understood the question that you wanted an answer to, that there were two places where, or two situations where the seller discloses the square footage.
Yep.
And I guess
We're about to do
unless you're disclosing it to the buyer, but the only other place I can think of is when the appraisal's done, by allowing the appraiser to come measure the home, that you're disclosing the square footage. I can't think of anything else. Did I not answer the question or understand?
Haven't gotten there yet.
Okay,
When we get to page 6 of the seller disclosures, I'll answer that question.
okay,
There's
thanks.
your answer, basically. Seller disclosure.
Yeah,
Okay, so on seller disclosures, how soon should you fill these out for the seller? It was a trick question. Go ahead, Denise. What is it?
Usually.
That's right. Trick question. Don't fill it out. Yeah, you should never fill it out. So the seller should fill this out. Now, what if it's a little old lady though? She's so cute and she's like, I just can't do it. I can't see very well. Can you just fill it out for me?
sorry, you can have your, the person that has been assigned to be your legal representative.
Yeah. Don't fill it out is the answer. Okay, yeah. All right, so but you can fill out this part. You can put in the seller's name, you can put in the address of the property and our brokerage. But the rest of this, I always just tell them, you've got a homework assignment. And your homework is to go through and fill this out. And I always tell them, it is better to disclose than not disclose. So sometimes people feel like, well, I don't want to tell them that we had a water leak or something. They won't want to buy my house. I always tell the seller, I'm more concerned, and when I'm on the buyer side, if I get a seller disclosure and up here at the top where it says, how long has the seller owned the property? And it says 15 years, and it looks like they've never had a problem with the property. As an agent, I'm more concerned with that than somebody who says, yeah, we had this water leak and this is what we did to fix it. Because if you've lived in the house, it's almost guaranteed you've had some type of a water leak or something, that a sink overflowed or something. But here's the bigger thing. And this is what I want the sellers to understand. Anything you disclose, you could never really be sued for it. I mean, and I say never really could be sued, but you could sue anybody for anything. But they're probably not going to win a lawsuit if you've disclosed. So approach it from the standpoint of that. And here's where I learned that is we had one of the attorneys that I kind of told you guys about on the Shal and May the other day. One of the attorneys that I worked with, and he's an awesome guy, but he was selling his house in Farmington. And I don't know why, but somehow the buyer told him, we're not going to do any inspections. And he told me, when they said that, he said, I went through and refilled out my seller disclosure. He said, I had them filled out, but as soon as I found out the buyer was not going to do a home inspection, I went through and changed my seller disclosure. And I was like, what do you mean you changed? And he said, I disclosed everything. He said, if I got to it and there was any chance at all that I could check yes, I did. And I said, okay, why? And he said, because here's the thing. If you end up in court, and now I've had one transaction in my whole career that went to court, and it was just small claims court. But if you end up in court and they've checked yes, like the person, so let me actually just tell you the one that I had. So I helped a lady sell her property. She moved to Indiana. She calls me a couple of years later and says, hey, I'm getting sued by the buyer. And I said, okay, for what? And she said, they said we didn't disclose that there had been water in the basement, like that the sewer had backed up. And she said, they said we hadn't disclosed that, and that some tree root branches grew into the sewer, which then caused it to back up, and they're suing us for like $1,100 or something. And I said, okay. And she said, but the problem is I gotta be there like Tuesday. And this was like a Friday or something. And I said, okay. She's like, it's gonna cost me $1,100 to fly out there. And they're suing me for $1,100. And I was like, well, then just pay them the $1,100. And she was like, no way, the principal, I'm not doing it. And I said, okay. The first thing I did is let's take a look at your seller disclosures. So I went to the seller disclosures and I looked, and she had checked the box that yes, there had been water but in the basement. And I said, hey, all you got to do is show up to small claims court, hand them the seller disclosures, and show that you disclosed, and that'll be good enough. So she did. She flew in. I went with her to small claims court. We got there. The judge said, okay, what are we here for? And the buyer said, we bought the house. There were so many boxes in the basement we couldn't see, but when we moved in, you could see a water line. It wasn't finished, the basement, but there were some 2x4s in there, you know, little walls that weren't sheetrock. And they said, you can see on the 2x4s that there's like a water line. And we didn't know about that. And they said, and the tree root branches grew into the sewer, and then the sewer backed up, and then we had all this problem. We think she should have to pay for it. So the judge said to her, okay, well, what do you have to say? And she walked up and handed him the seller disclosures and said, right here, we disclosed that we had water in the basement. And the judge looked at it and said to the buyer, is this your signature? An initial? Yep. He goes, so why are we here? And they said, well, but the tree root branches grew into the sewer. And he goes, the street I live on, that happens every year. Somebody has that problem take place at their house. Welcome to home ownership. Case dismissed. So here's the thing. Sometimes we naturally, if we were to fill these out, we're going to look at it and go, well, I don't want to make my house look bad. But the truth is, anything you put on there, if they then tried to sue you, a judge is going to look at it and go, Carmen, they told you that there was a problem. Why didn't you check it out? So that's what this attorney said, is essentially anything that's on here, think of it as this. This is essentially for the buyer, their way of when they get it, of the seller saying, you should check this stuff, is what this attorney said. He said, so the reason I changed all of these, he said, I checked yes on almost every single box, because if they ever tried to come back and sue me, I could then go to the judge and say, well, no, I told them there was a problem with I told them there was cracking in the stucco. See, that way a judge would go, well, they told you, why didn't, remember caveat emptor, buyer beware? Like that's what the whole idea of this is. If the seller has said, yes, we had a problem with this, a judge is going to look at it and go, well, they told you there was a problem. Why didn't you check it out further? Okay. All right. I beat that one. Okay. So now let's go to answer the question go to page 6 of this. Oh, in the event that there's not enough space on here, there's an addendum as well that they can fill out. Okay. So when you get to page 6 of 7, the second place they have to disclose where the square footage came from is to the buyer, and where they do it is right here in the seller disclosures on page 6 there. Okay, so a lot of times agents will put it in the MLS, which is fine, but technically it's here that they have to disclose. And then there's also another section about the Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act where they have to check it either is or is not. And then they're going to sign it here. The buyer's going to sign here. Now, sometimes buyers will be like, well, I don't want to sign it because that means I'm agreeing to it. No, that by them signing it, buyer's acknowledging their receipt of the copy. That's it. So if you ever have a buyer that's like, well, if I signed it, that means I agreed to it. No, if you read, it's just their signing is acknowledging they've gotten a copy. That's it. Okay. And then there's a spot here for a disclosure form update. So remember, I like giving it to the seller and telling him, here's your homework and fill it out sooner than later so that I can get it back from them so that I can be aware if there are any issues. But this spot has a spot for them to update the form. So let's say you go really even a couple of days and then you get an offer in, the seller needs to check the box either saying there are changes or there are no changes and then re-sign. Okay? Because it's possible that they say, nope, we never had any water damage. And then the next day, the pipe break, which by the way, that kind of stuff happens all the time. Never had a problem, and then as soon as they list the house, there's a problem. All right, so the next page is the addendum to the seller's property condition disclosures. So you'll notice here that you would just put, page whatever, item number whatever, and then the explanation of what happened. So that's the bigger thing for me is disclose, yes, we had a water problem or we had a roof problem or whatever. And then here, this is what we did about it. And as long as they're able to say, we had the problem, this is what we did about it. But again, if you ended up in court, the judge is going to go, well, they told you they had a water problem. Why didn't you check for mold? You should have known there would be mold. Okay? All right. Then the seller's going to sign, the buyer's going to acknowledge a receipt of it. And then next page is the wire fraud alert disclosure. On this one. So not as crucial with the seller, but we have here still this wire fraud alert disclosure that we have the seller sign. The idea of this is just making sure you guys and that they know there are people out there trying to steal their money. And what they're going to try to do is say, wire your money to here. Now, the good news is for a seller, pretty rare that they're going to be wiring money, but down the road, people are not going to have the amount of equity they have in their properties today. And you're going to come across times where maybe a seller does have to wire money to the bank or to the title company to close. And basically just saying, just don't trust instructions that come by email. And I usually tell the sellers or buyers even on this wire alert is essentially you almost want to go drive to the company that you're going to wire the money and talk to them in person and get the wire instructions. The outside of that, don't trust. Like some of the emails, I don't know if you guys have seen them, but some of the emails that people send on this will even, they'll say, hey, we've changed our wire instructions and this is where you should wire the money to. And then down at the bottom of the form, it'll say, wire fraud is a problem and don't trust, when you get alerted to what, like it's trying to look authentic. So just really make sure your clients, before they wire money, that you triple check that they should call the title company, but not from the email, because the email will say call to verify. And so these fake emails say call to verify. And if you call, they'll answer, North Star Title. Oh, yep, that's the right place. We had that happen actually a couple of years ago. An agent that used to be with our company but left, but she was going to buy a property from one of our agents. So she was an agent and the buyer. And she got the instructions wired. She wired $150,000 off. Now, luckily, I don't know how they did this, but they caught it like within a half an hour and were able to call it back because it just hadn't left the bank yet. But once it's gone, it's gone. Like you don't get it back. So anyway, that's the idea of this. It's just disclosing to your sellers. Be careful if you're ever going to wire money. Okay. And then I need to update this form. I just realized. All right, the last thing is this affiliated business disclosure. And we have a sister relationship with Inspiro and North Star. And so this affiliated business disclosure is disclosing to your clients that, and you'll notice right here in bold, it says you are not required to use the listed providers as a condition of settlement of your loan or purchase or refinance of the subject property. There are frequently other settlement service providers available with similar services. You're free to shop around to determine that you're receiving the best service and the best rate for these services. So we want them to use Inspiro. We want them to use North Star Title, but this purpose of this form is to let them know they don't have to. They could use anybody they want to, even though we would like them to use ours. So I need to update this because this doesn't have North Star on it, and we need to get that added. So there's the new one that now has it. So, all right, question. Oh, no, sorry, one more form. I thought we were done. Don't ask questions. All right, this last one is lead-based paint. And so the way the law reads is the seller has to disclose to the buyer before they write an offer if there's lead-based paint. So you're going to put in the address of the property. And I don't know why I need to update this one too, because it shows a checkbox and maybe I did it to say, don't check the box, but it should be an initial in here, that you're having an initial it. And the seller is gonna fill this out that they either know of lead-based paint on the property, or they're gonna initial this one that says they have no knowledge of lead-based paint. And then they're gonna initial that they have provided the buyer with any records that they have, or that they have no reports or records pertaining to lead-based paint. So the seller's got to disclose, do they know if they have lead-based paint? And if they do, we've given you all of the reports or records, or we have no knowledge and we don't have any reports. Or they could initial that they have knowledge, but they don't have any reports. So, okay. And then we'll cover the buyer one next week when we do the buyer part.
So with the boxes is the left, is they do acknowledge. Which side do they initial?
So yeah, inside the box, just initial in the box.
Okay. Which
So-
ones are differentiates that when they do acknowledge?
Oh, just if they have knowledge, they'll initial the, like a husband and then the wife here. If they have no knowledge, they'll initial down.
Oh, I got it.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So there's just one spot for husband and wife. And then section 4 is going to be where the agent's acknowledgement. So you as the listing agent then need to initial this one, which I gotta move this, I guess. You would initial that one to say you've informed the seller of their obligation to disclose, and then everybody gets to sign. So buyers, sellers, and both agents. Okay, and we'll cover the buyer part. Yeah, go ahead.
So you can ask the listing agent before you put an offer in.
So technically, the way the law is written is that, yeah, you should be getting this from them before writing an offer. Now, the good news is the way the MLS is structured now, if the property, if it needs one of these, which by the way, if it was built in 1978, do I need one of these?
Yes.
No,
Well, no, 78 or before
prior
is
to,
when you need it. Yes, yes.
just prior to, not 78 or before, just prior to 78. So if it was built in 78 or newer, you don't need it. Now, would it hurt to have it? No. So, if you're not sure, go ahead and do it. But the good news is, as soon as you are inputting in the MLS and you put the property was built 1977 or newer, or older, older, it's going to require you to upload a form in here. So that's where you should get it now. But used to be you had to call and say, hey, I need to get the lead-based paint disclosure so I could write an offer, which most agents still didn't do. But
So
now,
what do you think of agents that put this in the document section of the,
Yeah.
list?
yeah, that's what you want to do, is put it in the document section on the MLS so that an agent can just download. All right, what other questions? Okay, so for you guys on Zoom, if you have not put in first and last name and your license number at least one of the times, please do so I can give you CE credit at the end of the 12-hour thing. If you, and I only need the license number at least once, but so. All right. Anything else I can help you with? Okay. Well, thanks for being here. So next week, Tuesday, we'll do the CMA class. So basically what that's going to look like is I'm going to have a property that I'm going to just walk you through. Here's how I would do a CMA on this property. Okay. So that's what Tuesday will look like. But we also have Summit, so which starts at noon. So I will make sure we're done by 11:30 so we can all head over there, which I probably didn't think that through very well. I probably should not have done the class at all, actually. Oh, well. We'll be done by 11:30 so we can all head over there. So it starts at 10. Yeah, 10 o'clock on Tuesday. So, okay, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
So Russ, did you answer my question? Did I just go over my head? I don't.
Yes, on page 6 of the seller disclosures.
So, so you're saying that there's 2 places that you disclose. I thought you said 2 people.
Yep, they have to disclose it to the brokerage and to the buyer. And they do it to the brokerage in the listing agreement and to the buyer and seller disclosure.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah. I just, yeah. All right. Hey, thanks.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.